think last year or 2 years ago, she published a very great enthusiastic acclaim, a book called Techniques of Pleasure, BDSM and the Circles of Sexuality. She's working on a number of projects right now. One of them is on queer temporality in BDSM play with national trauma. That was the subject matter of her really wonderful lecture at the Center for the Humanities last semester. I'm sure some of you were there, and I'm really happy that she's now here to talk about just queer studies in general, I guess.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to stand here. Oh, you wouldn't know that. Cool. Because I don't have pictures for you or anything like that. Maybe, is there more light in this room? I like light. Okay, thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to you and to Mary Jane for inviting me to give a lecture, a theory lecture. And so we went back and forth about what to do for a little while, because I wanted to do a person, because the whole field is kind of seemed like a lot. But I'm going to give you an introduction to queer studies, to queer theory, so it's field introduction. Queer theory is dead. That, at least, is how some people, still very much alive and still doing what they might call queer theory, understood Michael Warner's 2012 Chronicle of Higher Education essay, Queer and Then. The essay's occasion was the end of Duke University Press's book series, Series Q, but Warner took the opportunity to reflect on the field of queer theory and how it had changed in the last 20 years. Such temperature-taking essays and deathbed visits are, perhaps oddly, par for the course, a course that's only existed as such since 1991. Warner himself, although perhaps displeased with some aspects of queer theory today, finds the widespread impression that queer theory is a thing of the past tragically mistaken. Instead, he writes, queer theory now has the shape of a searching and still largely undigested conversation, rich enough to have many branches, some different enough to be incommensurate with one another. Today I'm going to give you a short introduction to queer theory, or studies. You can choose what you like, depending on how you calculate the weight of the theoretical, organized around its multiple deaths and revivals. My talk has 3 parts: object, analysis, and desire. Each part traces the tension queer theory's oddly melancholy utopianism, as Warner puts it, that I suggest not only characterizes queer theory, but also produces these anxious surveys. My focus is on queer theory's utopic dreams and dashed hopes, its expansive vistas and analytical dead ends, the ways it seems that queer theory promises more than it can deliver. As I go along, I'll also introduce you to some of queer theory's key insights, arguments, and debates, and I hope this isn't too elementary for these terrains. I've set the stage for queer theory's very latest interventions. So, section 1, object. Gail Rubin, feminist anthropologist and queer theorist avant lettres, begins her 1984 essay, Thinking Sex, with what will become a famous line: "The time has come to think about sex." She continues, "To some, sexuality may seem to be an unimportant topic, a frivolous diversion from the more critical problems of poverty, war, disease, racism, famine, or nuclear annihilation. But it is precisely at times such as these, when we live with the possibility of unthinkable destruction, that people are likely to become dangerously crazy about sexuality." This essay aims to develop a radical theory of sex, a means to name and combat erotic injustice and sexual oppression. Rubin is interested in sex as a vector of oppression, and the hierarchies between sex that is deemed good, normal, natural, and blessed, sex that is heterosexual, married, monogamous, non-commercial, without toys, in dyads, and private between couples of the same generation, and sex that is deemed bad, abnormal, unnatural, and damned, sex that is homosexual, promiscuous, commercial, casual, sadomasochistic, in public, etc. For Rubin, a theory of sex as an axis of power shows the connections between people policed, surveilled, and marginalized through sexuality. Homosexuals, sure, but also sex workers, pedophiles, BDSMers, poly people, etc. I start with Rubin's radical theory of sex because it leads us to some of the tensions that characterize queer theory's object. With Rubin, we might say that the object of queer theory is sexuality and power, not gay and lesbian studies. This is what Teresa de Lauretis seems to have meant, and de Lauretis is credited with the first use of the phrase queer theory in print in a 1991 introduction to a special issue of Differences. It was based on a conference she'd organized at UC Santa Cruz in 1990. She says she got it from another conference the year before, 1989, but her 1991 coinage is what's usually accepted. What de Lauretis was imagining with this phrase was a break from gay and lesbian identities, which, as identities that also anchor social movements, silence as much as they enable, particularly differences of race and class, and between gay men and lesbians. Queer, she mused, might allow us to forge new commonalities that are not based on identity politics. A post or anti-identity politics also characterized queer politics and queer theory. Those of ACT UP, and perhaps especially Queer Nation, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, both of which marked a divergence from organizing around gay and lesbian identity rights. Queer politics was not only street-based, performative, think kiss-ins or die-ins, but more critically sought to reclaim or re-signify the shame and stigma of queer as the ground of politics. Queer, especially in AIDS politics, is not about the recognition of identities. AIDS doesn't care how you identify, but about a demand for life, for recognition of queer cultures and worlds. And so queer politics, by mobilizing and centralizing the term queer, aims at a complex mobilization of people beyond sexual identity. That today the term serves as a shorthand for sexual identity, seemingly at least in places like Wesleyan, shorn of its mobilizing shame or intensity, is a topic for another time. For we are still at the beginning of the 1990s, when queer seems to promise something more than gay and lesbian. De Lauretis writes that queer theory might transgress and transcend discursive categories and set terms. It's not so much that queer theory is against identities, as though that is possible. Instead, queer theory asks us to investigate the formations of such identities across time and space, rather than assume them, to ceaselessly interrogate both the preconditions of identity and its effects, as Anna Maria Jagos writes in 1996. This is the conceptual and speculative work queer might do for de Lauretis, who asks in her essay, can our queerness act as an agent of social change, and our theory construct another discursive horizon, another way of living the racial and the sexual? Lovely, utopic words, so full of potential, and so it may or may not come as a surprise that a mere 3 years later, de Lauretis abandoned queer theory on the grounds that it had been taken over by those mainstream forces and institutions it was coined to resist. She writes, writing about her just-released book, The Practice of Love, in 1994, as for queer theory, my insistent specification lesbian may well be taken as a taking of distance from what, since I proposed it as a working hypothesis for lesbian and gay studies in this very journal, Differences, has very quickly become a conceptually vacuous creature of the publishing industry. I will leave aside this charge for the moment. I promise I will return to it, since de Lauretis' turn away comes just at the moment that queer theory flourished as a way to register and rethink the way sexuality exceeds identity. Eve Sedgwick, for example, in her 1993 essay, Queer and Now, From Tendencies, the first book in Duke University Press's Series Q series, identifies queer theory as a practice reliant on reflection, speculation, close reading, even overreading. For Sedgwick, queer asks us to notice the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning that the I typed this, I think I typed it with an error. Excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. Unlike at Christmas, her lovely example in this essay, when all our social institutions speak in a single voice, her queer is about valuing the ways meanings and institutions can be at loose ends. Sedgwick's queer method then aims to open the apparent naturalness of heterosexual identity and desire and heterosexuality's cultural centrality to analysis and interrogation. Queer reading, queer gaps, Sedgwick's interest in the oblique, speculative pleasures of queer informs much of the low theory and queer affect studies I'll talk about at the end of the talk. This essay, Sedgwick's essay, also stages the recurrent question of the relationship between queer theory and same-sex sexuality. Sedgwick appears to be of two minds in this essay. On the one hand, she writes, given the historical and contemporary force of the prohibitions against every same-sex sexual expression, for anyone to displace lesbian and gay from queer's definitional center would be to dematerialize any possibility of queerness itself. On the other hand, she writes, a lot of the most exciting recent work around queer, and this is 1993, remember, spins the term outward along dimensions that can't be subsumed under gender and sexuality at all. And here she names race, ethnicity, and post-colonial nationality. Her 1990 book, Epistemology of the Closet, opens with this question, but frames it as a contradiction between minoritizing and universalizing views. The former imagines that the modern homo-heterosexual definition is relevant mainly for a small, distinct, relatively fixed homosexual minority, while the latter understands this definition as having continuous and determinate importance for people across the spectrum of sexualities. This contradiction, she argues, is not to be settled by the critic, as it is the pull between these poles that grants force to the social organization of sexuality, knowledge, and power in 20th century Western culture as a whole. That's her words. You can hear Foucault here, the Foucault of History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and it is worth pausing on Foucault, even though I will not give you a proper genealogy of queer theory, because it clarifies the consolidating object of queer studies as sexuality, power, not gay and lesbian identity. Foucault's famous declaration of the invention of the homosexual in History of Sexuality bolstered the work already happening in history and sociology. You may remember this passage. I'm going to read it. It's a little bit long. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a life form, and a morphology. Nothing that went into his total composition was unaffected by his sexuality. It was everywhere present in him. We must not forget that the psychological, psychiatric, medical category of homosexuality was constituted from the moment it was characterized. Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy onto a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphrodism of the soul. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. This passage, showing that homosexuality has a history, yes, but more than that, the specification of categories, of identities, is entwined with the medicalization and persecution of them, was transformative in gender, feminist, gay and lesbian, and queer studies more broadly. Indeed, in a 1994 interview between Gail Rubin and Judith Butler, Rubin recounts how central this book was to her thinking. She says, I was really just totally hot for that book. And Butler replies, yes, you made me hot for it too. But Foucault's main contribution to queer theory was not so much the history of the invention of the homosexual, rather it was his account of the deployment of sexuality. For it was not only about homosexuals, but also all those minor perverts, the zoophiles, the automonosexuals, the fetishists of various kinds, whose interior desires and occasional acts became truths of themselves. And you can see Rubin's essay extending this line. This is what it is to see the deployment of sexuality. The understanding that sexuality is not a drive, but rather a dense transfer point for relations of power. Consolidating in the 19th century around four figures, the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the procreative couple, and the pervert, sexuality for Foucault is a, quote, great surface network in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, and the strengthening of controls and resistances are linked to one another in accordance with a few major strategies of knowledge and power. This insight into sexuality as a field of regulation, of power knowledge, provided a way to not only trace the production of sexualized subjects, but also a framework for thinking, as Foucault put it, sex as a political issue. Sexuality, he writes, is at the pivot of two axes. The first focused on the body and the harnessing, intensification, and distribution of forces and energies, what we usually think of as discipline. The second focused on the species and the regulation, measuring, quantifying, appraising, and managing of populations. The second Foucault calls biopower. Understanding sexuality as the point between the life of the body and the life of the species gives us framework for thinking about sexuality and power in the broadest possible terms, leading from Rubin's taxonomy of sexual persecution through Sedgwick's unraveling of the modern homo-heterosexual distinction to more contemporary takes on transgender biopolitics or sexuality and state racism that carry forward Foucault's intervention. So at this point, one might say that the object of queer theory is sexuality and power. But immediately, one is beset with problems. One of the first to appear is the problem of gender's relationship to sexuality. In Rubin's essay, for example, she proclaims, quite infamously, that feminism is the theory of gender oppression, and so what we need is an autonomous theory of sexual oppression. This makes some sense when we consider that Rubin was writing against a strain of lesbian feminism that vilified sexual practices such as BDSM. Feminist theory's interest in gender-based hierarchies could not address, for Rubin, and perhaps even perpetuated, forms of sexual persecution that she had experienced. But still, this ground-clearing move is perhaps why the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, the first of its kind to anthologize the field and co-edited by our own Henry Abelove, began with Rubin's essay. As the editors write, lesbian gay studies does for sex and sexuality approximately what women's studies does for gender. Yet how, analytically, might we cordon off sex and sexuality from gender? As Butler writes in Against Proper Objects, such a division denies the normative operation of gender in the regulation of sexuality, which is, one could argue, the main contribution she has made to the field of queer theory. Her essay is a plea to move beyond and against those methodological demands which force separations in the interests of canonization and provisional institutional legitimation. She continues, for the analysis of racialization and class is at least equally important in the thinking of sexuality as either gender or homosexuality. And these last two are not separable from a more complex and complicitous formations of power. Indeed, it is that complexity and complicity that call to be thought most urgently, which means thinking against the institutional separatisms which work effectively to keep thought narrow, sectarian, and self-serving. I'm not sure who here Butler is calling self-serving, but I do think her call might be read descriptively, as it is arguments against such forced separations that drive much of the critical work in queer theory, especially in its early years. In these debates, the centrality of sexuality is at issue, its primacy in the field, which is not surprising given queer theory's debt not only to Foucault, but also to the psychoanalyst Lacan. In these foundational understandings of subjectivity, sexuality is not a difference, but the difference, not a form of power, but the form. I say this not to argue against those genealogies of queer theory that privilege the intersectional analysis of women of color feminism, for example, and its insistence on racialized sexualities, on the multiplicity of identity and positionality. But in works such as Butler's or Sedgwick's, widely recognized as the two founding mothers of queer theory, sexuality's special special relationship to subjectivity and to power both solidify its centrality to queer theory. And so even in these early years, queer theory seemed to circle around its object, sexuality, finding in it both everything, 20th century Western culture as a whole, and not enough. This might characterize the work of Rod Ferguson, whose Aberrations in Black inaugurated Queer of Color critique as the task of interrogating social formations as the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class. He writes, sexuality is not extraneous to other modes of difference. Sexuality is intersectional. It is constitutive of and constituted by racialized gender and class formations. If queer studies insist that our analyses of sexuality withdraw from theorizations of racialized gender and class formations, queer studies proves inadequate for understanding sexuality's broad epistemic dispersions. Yet the possibilities offered by queer theory make this analysis possible. Ferguson's own work offers an analysis of the deployment of African American sexual normativity as a mode of racialized governmentality, broadening the Foucauldian conceptual base of this queer theory. Connecting back to Rubin, Ferguson's work, like Kathy Cohen's, allows us to connect various figures queered by economic and social arrangements, welfare mothers, black drag queens, street sex workers, all rendered pathological, deviant, perverse through the deployment of sexuality. Although some in queer of color critique have found in queer a false universal that erases all difference but the one from straight, others have found in the very rejection of queer theory the theoretical tools through which to trace the particular form of power that bears down on those rendered queer, not normal, through racialized and gendered sexuality. Something similar might be said of work in queer disability studies, crip theory, and trans studies. Reflecting on the purported death of queer theory in 2012, Warner writes that, even in the beginning, the tremendous intellectual energy of what would come to be called queer theory was already casting a much broader net than lesbian and gay studies. One result over the years has been a succession of movements in which the critical project is joined and adapted by those who have different constituencies in view: trans studies, post-colonial queer studies, queer race studies. Each of those often begin by distancing themselves from what they take to be narrower versions of queer theory. Thus, queer theory has often seemed, from its very inception, to be elsewhere or in the past. I take this to be queer theory's object, sexuality of power, along with all the contestations that dyad has provoked. In this way, queer serves as an opening, a rather utopic field of possibility, yet one that is tied, perhaps frustratingly, disappointingly, to the very operations of power that motivate its emergence. In Critically Queer, Butler's 1993 essay, she writes, if the term queer is to be a site of collective contestation, the point of departure for a set of historical reflections and future imaginings, it will have to remain that which is, in the present, never fully owned, but always and only redeployed, twisted, queered from a prior usage and in the direction of urgent and expanding political purposes. The term will be revised, dispelled, rendered obsolete to the extent that it yields to the demands which resist the term, precisely because of the exclusions by which it is mobilized. It is only through such redeployments, in other words, that queer theory might, in Doloridis' now retracted words, construct another discursive horizon. Section 2, analytic. But perhaps sexuality or sex and power isn't really queer theory's object. Or perhaps rather than an object, queer theory has a stance, a position, an analytic. That is, queer theory stands, in Michael Warner's oft-cited phrase from his 1991 introduction to Fear of a Queer Planet, as resistance to regimes of the normal. This phrase comes in Warner's coinage of heteronormativity, which he defined as heterosexual culture's exclusive ability to interpret itself as society. Heteronormativity is a claim that humanity and heterosexuality are synonymous, which gives to heterosexuality an invisible, tacit, society-founding rightness. As he and Lauren Berlant developed the term in their later Sex in Public, heteronormativity is our national culture, consisting of a love plot of intimacy and familialism that signifies belonging to society in a deep and normal way. Because a heteronormative logic of the sexual order is deeply embedded in an indescribably wide range of social institutions, for Warner the task is not for gays and lesbians to gain toleration or equal status, but instead seek to challenge those institutions and accounts. This is why queer rejects minoritizing models of tolerance in favor of, quote, a more thorough resistance to regimes of the normal. For both academics and activists, he writes, queer gets a critical edge by defining itself against the normal rather than the heterosexual. And normal includes normal business in the academy. We'll come back to that point. Heteronormativity, he writes, can be overcome only by actively imagining a desirably queer world. Following this logic, and prefiguring work like Lee Edelman's, Warner suggests that queer politics opposes society itself. The utopianism of queer theory is evident here, as is its almost imperialist reach and desire to queer the world. This foundational work on heteronormativity is so foundational that students tell me the term is taught to all incoming freshmen in orientation, has spawned, not Warner's definition though, I don't think, has spawned other work developing and recalibrating Warner's political critique. Berlant and Warner's conception of a national heterosexuality that even homosexuals might belong to laid the ground for what Lisa Dugan called homonormativity. In 2002, gay and lesbian politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them. As part of the sexual politics of neoliberalism, homonormativity seeks, quote, access to the institutions of domestic privacy, the free market, and patriotism, same-sex marriage, consumer citizenship, access to the military, rather than social transformation. This phrase, homonormativity, captured for many a queer dismay with mainstream gay and lesbian politics in the US. In the 2005 special issue, What's Queer About Queer Studies Now?, David Eng, Judith Halberstam, and Jose Munoz answer their own question in Dugan's terms. Queer Studies Today, they write, critiques the, quote, liberal demands of a nationalist gay and lesbian US citizen subject petitioning for rights and recognition before the law, by showing how those demands remap and recode freedom and liberation in narrow terms of privacy, domesticity, and the unfettered ability to consume in the free market. Situating homonormativity within another national frame, Jasper Toire's influential coinage of homonationalism combines Dugan's homonormative gay and lesbian politics with a revived post-9/11 American patriotism. Homonationalism, for Poire, describes the dynamic through which some homosexuals are sanctioned as good gay and lesbian citizens, not only through the proliferation of sexual racial subjects who invariably fall out of the narrow terms of acceptability, as previous work on sexual normativity emphasized, but, back to Poire, more significantly, through the simultaneous engendering and disavowal of populations of sexual racial others who need not apply. These populations, to return to a Foucault routed through Agamben and Mbembe, are targeted for death. In Poire's reading, Mark Bingham, the gay pilot, do you remember Mark Bingham? The gay pilot who tried to divert one of the hijacked planes on September 11th, is a gay American patriot folded into life and to the nation, while the Muslim others, the sexually pathological terrorist or the perverse terrorist look-alike, are cordoned off for detention and deportation. In places like Abu Ghraib, Poire argues, the deferred death of one population recedes as the securitization and valorization of the life of another population triumphs in its shadow, through the claims to sexual exceptionalisms that bolster the superiority of the US nation and justify its actions. So the US Supreme Court's overturning of sodomy bans, for example, that's one sign of American progress that also justifies its war missions as a kind of imperialist saving. I linger on terrorist assemblages, which came out in 2007, because it does several things relevant to us here today. This is Poire's book. First, it disrupts the heteronormativity of the US state and our national culture, what Warner and Berlant argued about the heteronormativity of the US state, by showing a more dynamic relationship between sexual exceptionalism and US imperialism, and so expanding what we might think of as normative. And second, it posits the queer not as a category of sexuality against the more identitarian gay and lesbian, but against those forms of sexual racial life of use to the nation. These expansions of the concepts of queer and normal lead Warner in his 2012 essay to see Poire's work as a criticism of queer theory. But it is in fact this movement, expansion and contraction, exclusion and revision that characterizes business as usual in queer theory. And indeed, the concept of homonormativity has structured much contemporary work in the field, You work on, for example, queer settler colonialism. Right now there is a panel on settler colonialism that Professor Kealani Kawanui has organized that I would be at if I wasn't already here. In all of this work, queer theory continues, as Warner wrote, to name, quote, a wide field of normalization as the site of violence, even as its purview has broadened to include empire, globalization, neoliberalism, sovereignty, and terrorism, as the editors of What's Queer About Queer Studies now name, linking sexuality and normativity with questions of US and other state imperialisms. Yet, if this marks an expansive new terrain for queer theory, it might retain the same old analytic or stance against the normative. This is the argument made most recently by Robin Wigman, who in her Object Lessons notes that queer theory's anti-normativity project seems to have hardened into an epistemological given, with the effect of removing normativity as a question or object of inquiry that might generate a historically specific analysis. Indeed, as she writes, queer theory's anti-normativity might serve as a new normativity. This produces a fixed and decidedly tautological argument that goes something like this. Queer is anti-normative. Queer critique critiques anti-normativity. Queer critique critiques normativity. Queer critique is queer. As Tom Belsdorff notes, this kind of queer analysis can veer into a self-congratulatory exercise where the cast of characters is settled and the conclusion known in advance, surrendering the explanatory power and critical acumen of queer theory as a means of interrogating such dynamics and instead reifying their political effects. And this, Robin Wigman's is the most sort of recent in a line of critique that is also Biddy Martin's and Janet Jacobson's. Yet a perhaps more intriguing issue with this anti-normative normativity returns us to the problem De Lauritis voiced at the start, the problem of queer theory's institutionalization. And this is indeed the crux of Wigman's argument. Anti-normativity, as queer theory's, quote, inherently radical political position, underwrites its institutional authority. In this situation, queer studies' critical authority comes from its purportedly radical politics and rests on its tautology, knowing the difference between queerness and normativity and already being set against that normativity. In 2003, David Halpern worried over this same problem, writing that queer theory seemed more congenial to established institutions of the liberal academy than lesbian and gay studies, more easily folded back into the standard practice of literary and cultural studies without impeding academic business as usual. As long as queer was abstracted from its lesbian, gay, or bisexual or transgender specificity, it could serve as a generic badge of subversiveness, a more trendy version of liberal that would appeal to a variety of progressive academics, this is Halpern's words, without necessitating any particular political or social program. And with this, we're back with De Lauritis. As soon as queer is marked off, it's taken up into precisely those institutions it seeks to critique. You can see why this frustrated De Lauritis, and also why, in Against Proper Objects, Butler asks us to avoid marking territory in a bid for recognition. She writes, "There is more to learn from upsetting such grounds, reversing the exclusions by which they are instated, and resisting the institutional domestication of queer thinking. For normalizing the queer would be, after all, its sad finish." This is 1997. So here we are today at an In Theory lecture where I'm introducing the field of queer studies. And still, of course, this sort of normalization has not killed queer theory, not in 2003 when Halpern was writing, and not in 1995 either, when Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner first worried over the potential calcification of theory in its institutionalization, 1995, 4 years after its coinage. They suggested queer commentary, not theory, as a way to defer a set answer to the question, what does queer theory teach us about X? Resisting this normalization, queer commentary, as they write, is an inclusive project connecting academics and activists, an open field that is radically anticipatory, that is trying to bring a world into being, to make the world queerer. And so again, we see that what may appear as the death of queer theory, its institutionalization, its normative anti-normativity, as instead a sign of its continued life, as an incitement to and endorsement of its utopic reach. I have one thing. I brought in, Jill Morawski said that all theory lectures had to have some reference to smoking. So I brought in the collection After Sex. See the cover? Okay, so you'll see that after sex there is or there should be smoking. This collection, a special issue of SAQ, asked contributors, all big names in queer theory, to reflect on what in their work wasn't queer. They did so, the editors say, this is 2011, because they'd heard that queer theory was dead. And they ask after this question of after. What is queer theory after that first rush, after that first time, now that it's institutionalized? This brings me to my final section on queer theory's desire. I start this section with a passage from Leigh Edelman's commentary on the unstate of queer theory. This is from 1995. Kind of long, but it's good. Can desire survive its naming? Can it survive in the place of its naming, in the state to which and as which, by naming it, it is named? Queer theory can only remain a desire, and like desire, it depends for its energy, for its continuing power to grip us, on the impossibility of knowing its boundaries, of knowing its coherence as a state. The desire of and for queer theory demands a continuous and continuously unsettling challenge to the institutionalization of pleasures, including the pleasures of institutionalization, insofar as they ignore the remainder or excess that designates the distance between the representations by which we know our pleasures and the uncompromising insistence of our self-contradictory and hence radically incorrect desires. This final section is short, I promise, and necessarily sketchy, as it aims to think with Edelman about the field's political desires. In Wigman's analysis, one of the crucial problems with the institutionalization of queer theory, along with what she calls other identity knowledges, what she calls identity knowledges, is its use of critique to, quote, discern how other people's ideas are inadequate to the desires we have invested in them, which I think is a useful way to think about some of the expansions of queer theory discussed earlier. But more than this, she worries that such criticism might cloak our own professional investments in the noble rhetoric of the political desire that incites it. The non-equivalence between politics and professionalization for Wigman produces disappointment. She asks, what happens when what you once loved no longer satisfies your belief that it can give you what you want? Perhaps this disappointment in the field, in what it has given us, and in our ability to believe in it, is what has motivated queer theory's recent turn not only to affect, a turn with resonance across the university, but more specifically to negative affect, to bad feelings. I'm thinking of work like Heather Love's Feeling Backward, which explores the corporeal and psychic costs of homophobia as an archive of feelings such as nostalgia, regret, shame, despair, resentment, passivity, escapism, self-hatred, withdrawal, bitterness, defeatism, and loneliness. Why turn to this depressing archive, especially when the gay march toward victory insists that we have progressed beyond such painful paths? For Love, it is not to rescue or save these texts, to redeem them, so that we might affirm both the progress narrative of history and our own queer identity, but because such backward feelings serve as an index to the ruined state of the social world. They indicate continuities between the bad gay past and the present. Other queer affect work similarly urges us to consider our bad feelings as an index of the social. work by Lauren Vermont on cruel optimism, by Sarah Ahmed on the false closure of happiness, by Jose Munoz on feeling brown, and by Anne Svetkovich, whose scholarly memoir on depression recounts just barely surviving her time here at Wesleyan as a postdoc at CHUM. This work at the Center for the Humanities. This work is broadly diagnostic, queerly connecting the affective with the political. And several of these authors are also part of the activist collective Fuel Tank, who produced the excellent slogan, "Depressed, it might be political." This work is also written in a mode that is usually called reparative rather than paranoid or political, following but also departing from the way Eve Sedgwick described these modes of critical reading in her 2003 essay. Instead, in other words, of an opposition to the regimes of the normal, this work explores the queer as a way of feeling and knowing that seeks attunement with its object rather than critical distance or mastery of it. This work presents, or perhaps presents itself, as a challenge to queer theory's criticalness, reading not to critique, but for pleasure, to linger in its archive with and alongside and attached to its often odd and awkward objects. This would characterize the work of Jack Halberstam, who calls what she does in The Queer Art of Failure, 2011, low theory that, quote, asks little questions, settles for less than grandiose answers, speculates without evidence, and finds insights in eccentric and unrepresentative archives. But there's another way to read Whitman's question, what happens when what you once loved no longer satisfies your belief that it can give you what you want. And this is why I started with Edelman, whose hope for queer theory as desire, and thus as always excessive, insistent, unsettling, incoherent, speaks less to despair than to hope. This is a somewhat unconventional reading of the man everyone in queer theory loves to hate. I know, but stay with me. I'm speaking, of course, of Edelman's 2004 No Future. In it, as you may know, Edelman argues that since all politics, quote, attempt to produce a more desirable social order, which it then intends to transmit to the future in the form of its inner child, then all politics is guided by what he calls reproductive futurism, and thus preserves, quote, the absolute privilege of heteronormativity by rendering unthinkable, by casting outside the political domain, the possibility of a queer resistance to this organizing principle of communal relations. Queerness, for Edelman, names the side of those not fighting for the children. It figures outside and beyond its political symptoms, in the place of the social order's death drive. Rather than attempt to rescue the queer from the place of true abjection, true abjection, queerness should embrace, accept, and even embrace queer's negativity. Queerness then has no future. Queers should say, fuck the future. Compare, as so many have, Jose Munoz's recent cruising Utopia, which agrees with Edelman that the political possibilities offered today are toxic, but argues, sounding unlike Edelman, that queerness is the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with possibility. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. Queer is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present, offering hope in the place of Edelman's despair, or perhaps better, refusal. Munoz's queer future and revived critical theory is about risking the likely disappointment of our desire for another social world. Yet in what will be, I promise, my final turn, it is also possible, as Kevin Floyd does, to read both Munoz and Edelman symptomatically as a sign of queer studies crisis, and so as an opening toward contradictory futures. I'm thinking of queer theory's future, of course, and the tension between hope and despair, utopia and refusal, everything and nothing that structures queer theory's political feelings. This is perhaps a queer persistence of utopia, especially at a time when hope might seem silly, juvenile, or childish. All you might know ways we could also describe the queer. But this might work for such an excessive field, laminated with flamboyance, as Sedgwick put it, even as it hones its critical eye. And here, Edelman's words might serve useful. Queer theory, he writes, is utopic in its negativity. It curves endlessly toward a realization that its realization remains impossible. That only as a force of derealization, of dissolution into the fluxions of a subjectless desire, can it ever be itself. What then, Edelman asks, can one say of queer theory to those who are gathered to attend to its state? Reinvent it, resist it, refuse it, pursue it, get over it, just do it. That's that. Have questions or thoughts, feelings you want to share? You want to smoke?
So how do you resist how do you resist queer theory? I mean, does it suppose that you already know what it is, you're already engaged in it?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is there's some sort of trajectory of how we're doing critical theory. Why do I say critical theory when I mean queer theory? Queer theory in the academy. I mean, is there any kind of logic to the institutional history of queer studies, or do you feel like there's certain patterns that just sort of keep repeating themselves? Is there sort of like the structure of different approaches, or is there really a sort of historical logic that one can actually discern over time?
I don't know. I mean, maybe I could produce a historical logic. I didn't do it in the. I tried to introduce you to the field through a heuristic, right? Which I think describes the field and its intensities. So that's what I was kind of going for. And I think that. I don't know. I mean, I guess it might be possible to produce that history, but I'm not really sure. I mean, my thought is that those debates are what energizes queer theory in its institutionalization before, although it was always institutional. So the kind of anxiety over what that institutionalization might mean and its kind of closure of the political, that is what kind of drives you.
But without institutionalization, there would be nothing there. There would be no other.
Right. I'm saying that the idea
right?
that there is a outside to institutionalization is not true, not possible. So instead, it serves as the sort of incitement to produce more institutionalized queer theory,
Right.
Which has effect. It's not. I mean, I'm not on the anti-institutional side. And that's what I tried to do with normativity too. That it's its anti-normativity even as a norm that produces new readings of the social and of power that are really powerful, useful, diffused. So yeah. What else? What do they teach you about homonormativity? I want to know about that.
I'm just I guess especially in relation to your the first section about objects, but all the way through I keep thinking of queer theory as a sexy deconstruction.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you can say more about that. I mean,
well, I mean, it depends. Like, you can do a more refined reading of queer theory through like Sedgwick and Sedgwick's deconstruction and what she does in sort of her reading practice, or through Butler, and kind of nuance the history. But that's fair to say, I think. I mean, I kind of left aside a proper genealogy of queer theory, etc. I'd rather introduce you to queer theory, like what people are doing in the field, than where it comes from. And it's so contested anyway. But I thought Foucault was a good sort of organizing thing. Oh, you could do Foucault and Lacan, and then I mean, this is we've talked about this in terms of the lack of sort of queer animal studies work, and the kind of what you said in last week in your talk about the kind of linguistic turn and the necessary humanism of post-structuralism, structuralism, right? And that the effect of that in queer theory, I think, is one reason why animal studies hasn't found quite the home in queer theory that it has.
It keeps drawing people.
It does, but there's so that's something to read, but no.
No, it's an interesting question, whether animal studies is trying to find a home in queer studies.
Or queer studies,
I think
is
it's
trying to expand its queer.
That's what I think that's
so like,
happening.
why
That's what's
not
happening.
queer animals and other, and
And
kind of
ecologies.
right.
Yeah,
But yeah.
the queer ecology is
What does it mean when people use queer as a verb? Like we should queer this space or queer animal studies?
That's a great question. What do you think it means?
I have connotations of like weird, anti-normative,
Yeah.
and, I guess anti-bureaucratic,
Yeah.
or anarchic, kind of whatever. But
Right.
I mean, that's all theory. I mean, like, I think, and then once, of course, it materializes, it becomes a, norm or some kind of thing itself. So
Right.
how does it? How are these things translated into some kind of praxis?
Well, okay, so I feel like there are two different. So one is like it might not be the creation of norms that's the problem, but like which norms those are. So it might be that queering something to produce like more livable norms would be the goal. That's one answer, and goes in the direction of like somebody like Elizabeth Pocanelli's work. But in terms of queering, I mean, I think it's usually used as Sedgwick did, as a kind of reading practice. So like queering is reading to notice the places that things don't line up, to see the kind of reading things against themselves, which is deconstruction. But with a kind of excess is sexy deconstruction, and a kind of attention to maybe to the odd or to the awkward.
I haven't heard it in relation to text. I hear it about like queering like space.
Queering space.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a out there.
Yeah.
That in
Yeah.
classes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have anything to say about that. I don't know what that
I didn't know what it meant
No.
either, that's why I asked.
Yeah.
So you spoke at length about the project of sort of expanding the domain of queer theory to include groups other than the sort of original contingent. And I'm wondering, like, what about the big divide? Like, what about straight people? Particularly in the context of Edelman's sort of seeing the heart of queerness in being like sort of a rejection of maturity. Like, is that something that you think could be expanded sort of beyond sexuality generally?
Is what something?
The rejection of futurity. Like, could you be sort of like a straight white male anti futurist?
Yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, yes. I mean, I think what's important is that queer theory was a critique of gay and lesbian studies in its inception. So it kind of was locked in a dance with gay and lesbian identity, right? Like it's critical, but those are the two terms. But then somebody like Gail Rubin, and that's why I started with her, was interested in people, I mean, we could say queered by sort of sexuality and power, not about gay and lesbian identity. So she's interested in all sorts of people who recognize their sexuality in that way. And other people too, like Kathy Cohen's work, which is about non-heteronormative heterosexuals. So people who are queered through like racial pathology, and other kinds of modes of power have expanded that relationship. So, and for Edelman, I mean, that's a good question, the queer position there is it's the death drive of the social order. It's not a position that a gay or lesbian subject, like any subject, can really assume. It's not a subject position. So go for it. Yeah. But anyway, there's also work on like sort of queer heterosexuality that's kind of taken off in these directions, and kind of tried to think through some of those problems.
I have a quick question about, you've mentioned sort of in the later iterations and the sort of affective turn in the 2000s or late 1990s, the practice of archiving.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I like in terms of practical heuristics, like what exactly that means, and then also was it present in the Gail Rubins and the Judith Bowers
Yeah.
and so why are we hearing about it
Right.
so much now?
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that question. That's a really good point. Yes.
Yeah.
So the attention to like what is called this kind of weird archive or
Yeah.
low archive or popular culture counts. Certainly for Halberstam, that's mainly the archive is a like animated movies and then it also is an attempt to kind of queer disciplinary methodology, one that I'm not sure I have questions about, but it's to get away from kind of literary critical reading of texts, right, and instead focus on low objects, right, not high art, not novels, not the canon, but these sort of marginalized objects. For someone like Anne Spektovich, that's like how to read the lesbian archive through like ephemera. So there too, it's like an opposition between what a sort of state archive might collect, like the kind of written documents that would be deemed relevant to the art, like important to national identity and thus collectible, and these like ephemera, like I don't know, I have a lot of ephemera in here right now. So I know we would try to collect because it's just sort of residue of everyday life. That material is actually containing kind of key affective material. So it has to do with the kind of like the normative and the dominant and the high versus the marginal, the excluded, the low. But people have been doing readings of this stuff for a long time. So, yeah.
Given the the last quote you cited about like queer theory being impossible,
Yeah.
Would you, or I guess the prevailing like line of thought and amongst most of the scholars that you're citing, be that in terms of like an overarching political theory, the only kind of system that queer theory can really wed itself to is anarchism, because especially with the last part of the statement, talking about like reinventing it, reusing it, doing it, that's like what I'm most reminded of. So like queer theory is still something that can exist under different political systems, but like the thing that it finds its most, like its biggest fulfillment in would be in an overarching kind of like framework of like, that's what you're aiming towards, as impossible as it is,
So
but
there
you're
are some
working
people
toward
who would
it.
agree. There's new stuff in queer anarchism that if you're interested in this intersection, I would recommend checking out. But I don't think that would characterize the political horizon for a lot of the people that I'm talking about, or their ideas about what queer critique might accomplish. So a kind of dissent from liberal political models, for sure. But a lot of this work is about creating sort of coalitional politics around like transforming social institutions. It's not really anarchist in its agenda, although there is queer anarchist work. So I guess I wouldn't characterize this queer theory as anarchist in its vision.
Is it nihilist?
Necessarily. No.
No.
I don't think so. I think it's incredibly hopeful.
Nihilist can be hopeful.
Well, maybe.
I was venturing to say anarchist because it sounded like I mean, it's not totally like anti-institutional, it's anti-institutions that are like, imposed or forced upon, and this is like trying to make institutions that are empowering you, so.
Yeah.
that's-
Well, in that sense, yeah.
That was a kind of.
Yeah, although I think institutionalization is a kind of necessary condition for the production of a lot of good work, so. And I think, and that's, I'm not saying that as like a critic outside of queer, like all these people would, most of them would say that too. So, yeah, maybe they wouldn't, I shouldn't attribute things.
Yeah, just picking up on the very little queer anarchism, I know there's like a conference or panel discussion this Friday about queer prison abolition.
There is.
Yeah. And there's also a conference in Boston this Saturday called the Pink and Black Coalition about the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So what is like queer studies' relationship with prison abolition?
Well, thank you for mentioning this. So I would like to invite you all to a panel discussion on Friday at 4:15 at Russell House on queering prison abolition with three scholar activists. And I don't think you can set, like, queer studies doesn't have a but prison abolition and a sort of queer imaginary. I mean, this has been a really fruitful location through which to think about abolitionist politics. So, like, the three people coming are all queer and trans public intellectual scholars, activists, and it's the sort of queer. Both the abolition and queer in that are kind of like utopic imaginings of some other kind of world, some other possibility that could only be reached through sort of reconfiguring practice in the present moment, right, through a kind of relational. So, I mean, you'll have to come on Friday to hear more about those dynamics. But it's through like thinking about how bodies have been criminalized, pathologized through gender, sexuality, that's created a kind of class of those who could be incarcerated. I mean, there's a lot that sort of prison abolition learns from queer theory and vice versa. And this is one of the intersections. And a kind of vibrant queer political project at the moment. Yeah.
I'm curious as to, I guess, how much is queer theory, as we discussed it, like very culturally situated, and how do these theorists kind of relate or discuss their things internationally, where there are other cultures that may not contest or discuss gender or sexuality in the same way?
I can barely hear you, but I think you're asking about queer theory's national.
Internationally, like sort of how culturally situated certain of these theories are, and like how much do they also discuss other cultures where sexuality or gender are not necessarily
Okay,
the
so
same.
that's a great question, and one that's very close to my heart as a queer anthropology person. So what I've given you is a kind of like U.S.-based queer theory. That is the normative field, and so that's the introduction that you have gotten. Queer theory has attempted to internationalize or transnationalize along with many other. In fact, I read somebody claiming that maybe transnational was the new queer, right? As a kind of like the new hot thing, and it's not that new anymore. But anyway, right? So to transnationalize queer theory is like that's really great. That project is incomplete. Somebody like Puar's work has been used to think more critically, of course, out with the U.S. in relation, like a kind of U.S. imperialism and its relation to war in particular. But it's not. I mean, I have so much to say about this that I am not sure what to say. There are people doing queer anthropology who take up exactly these questions and the possibilities of these categories and their sort of transnational circulation, what we can attribute to them, what politics means, what liberation means, what is normative. in very useful and I think really interesting ways. I'm looking at Ben because they're in my class, or this is all we talk about. But that work is not really read that often in queer theory proper. Some of it is, but most of it isn't. So that raises sort of interesting question about the national purview of the field. Yeah.
It's just to follow up, it
Yeah.
just seems like that dimension, the transnational dimension, is perfectly suited to what I've taken away as the project of queer theory, because it's precisely about interrogating what sex and gender might mean in other.
Yeah, I mean, I think queer theory has created a set of like really useful tools for people in anthropology who are already doing some of that, of course. But like a field like American Studies, you'd say, the transnational turn in these fields is transnational in relation. It's a kind like so U.S. imperialism or a kind of right to point transnationality. Whereas anthropology has a totally different imagination of what the transnational might look like, what are important sites in that, and how to think about culture and those relationships. So there's some lack of
Tension,
these.
there's tension.
I don't even know if it's tension. I think it's just like
They go back, they pass each other and.
yes, but it could be. Yes, some of us have those conversations, but it's not a kind of wide one. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you all so much.